Oh God, Dane.
Some of you may remember this iconic moment on Britain's Got Talent. A harsh-looking woman with tight curly hair, wild eyebrows, a pinched face, and a bulky build hesitantly steps out on the stage. She tries to act cool and confident, but the judges aren't buying it. Simon Cowell asks her what's the dream, and she replies she wants to be a singer. This young woman's face in the crowd says all you need to know about this woman's dream. The judges reluctantly let her sing, and this happens.
I dreamed a dream in time gone by.
Didn't expect that, did you? Did you? No.
This is Susan Boyle, and since her explosive appearance on Britain's Got Talent, she has led a successful singing career. Now, the reason I bring this up is that booting up Duel Masters for the PS2 was the experience of watching Susan Boyle walk out on stage. I was mortified by the hideous artwork, terrible voice acting, and generic characters. Except for Keanu Reeves here. One of my first thoughts was, this looks like an anime drawn by an American. Figured. My first impressions of this title were not just wary, but malevolent. I couldn't wait to rip this thing apart. But just like Susan Boyle's performance, Duel Masters blew away my expectations. Sure, it's not the best game I've played for the challenge, but among the 13 titles, it's surpassed more than half, which is more than I would have thought a week ago. If you're new to the channel and want to support my effort to beat every PS2 RPG, subscribe and hit that bell. Also, if you join the Pro tier on Patreon, you can request your own video today. One final note, if you would like to see the list of PS2 games I've beaten or intend to beat, and their associated scores, I've put a link to the Google Sheet in the description of this video. If you'd like to skip my review and just see a summary of my thoughts, jump ahead to the time on the screen. For everyone else, here are all my thoughts and experiences playing and beating Duel Masters. The story of Duel Masters is, well, kinda confusing, but also incredibly simple. There's this evil lady named Widow that just somehow sealed away the elemental cards or something. To be honest, I'm still kinda confused as to what happened. Right away, I think that Duel Masters falls short of its inspiration Yu-Gi-Oh! Where the latter attempted to justify the card's supernatural nature with pharaoh voodoo magic, Duel Masters is just like, they're magic, whatever. After the sealing takes place, Knight, goes to find the heroes of the world, who happen to be 5 kids that coincide with the 5 elements. Now, again, as the story began, I just kept rolling my eyes. Seeing these 5 generic characters, I could hardly tell one from another. I imagine I would be able to guess how each would play out from just looking at them, but I was wrong. Some of these characters actually surprised me. The game breaks down the main story into 5 individual campaigns aligned with the 5 kids. The consistent narrative among all 5 is that they have to collect the 9 pieces of their respective element's spiritual monster card in order to battle Widow. I'm not going to go through each campaign in the order I picked them, but in the order I enjoyed them. Unfortunately for me, I started with the worst campaign of the 5. When considering which characters to play as, I landed on the emo kid Flynn. Dark Element sounded interesting, and he looked the least ridiculous of the 5. Anyway, not only is his part of the story boring and plotting, but he is void of any character whatsoever.
Hey, Caitlin, let's duel.
I'm busy.
All right.
My feelings about this title continued throughout his campaign. It also didn't help that a dark deck is one of the more complicated elements to play, enforcing my expectations that I was playing a bad game. Rusty is the fire type character, and the only one that isn't high school age. His story is pretty much this.
I'm the best. I'm the best fire duelist there is. I'm the best. Awesome. I'm the best. Duh. Yeah. I'm the best.
He doesn't really develop a personality, and the only interesting thing about him is that Trey, the nature element hero, is his older brother.
Duel Masters isn't about the cards, Rusty. It's about how you use them.
And why don't you use them to win once in a while?
After beating the game, it's obvious that Rusty was intended to be the player's first campaign, as his story actually takes time to explain a bit about the world. Now, putting Flynn and Rusty aside, the remaining 3 is where my interest started to peak. Luke's story starts out much different than any of the others. He's in a tournament and is framed by the Light Guild's leader into being a cheater. He's thrown out of the tournament and has to get his reputation up in order to duel Widow. Luke's personality really isn't all that interesting, but I have to say, the conflict of everyone thinking he's a cheater does make for a more compelling narrative than the previous 2. At one point, he goes to play a small tournament in his class, and the teacher has to check his deck. Also, there was this.
I'm here for the clan wars. You up for a duel? That's right, I'm here to duel ya. My skills will fool ya, smack down and school ya. And when I bring it to the zone, you know I'm gonna rule ya.
Rebecca is the only female of the 5 and the water element character. Now, Rebecca was the second campaign I played, and her story and deck changed the way I saw this title. Water is the single best element in the game, but we'll talk about that shortly. Rebecca's story starts out interesting like Luke's. Rebecca's doting aunt happens to be Widow. Her disguise is impeccable. Rebecca seems to not know this, and Knight hesitates to tell her. Everyone treats Rebecca like an idiot, and to be honest, she comes off as one as well. Knight and Rebecca's aunt, who is Widow, asks her to collect the 9 pieces of the water beast for them. Knight suspects that Widow is duping Rebecca into joining their side when this happens.
The things we're about to tell you will come as quite a shock. You must prepare yourself. It's about your amphibian.
Oh, you mean how she's actually the widow? Or do you mean how she tried to bind the new creatures to cards before the temple tournament ceremony? Yeah, I figured that stuff out. Don't worry though, I'll find the 9 pieces. Thanks for the signature card.
I, like Knight, was legitimately surprised by this and thought, you know, the devs actually put some thought into her. Now, Rebecca's campaign was enjoyable, but the best of the best was Trey. Trey is the Joey Wheeler of the group. He sucks at Duel Masters and constantly loses to the Dark Clan's leader, Marcus.
The bodies hit the floor, let the bodies hit the... I'm the best!
Unlike the others, he doesn't get along with Knight and the Nature Monk, and ends up having to pick up the quest for the 9 pieces on his own. All the while, everyone mocks him for not being able to beat Marcus.
Hey Trey, lost to Marcus yet today?
Nope. Have you kissed his...
Hey!
The story of Trey peaks here, where you go to face off against the nature element beast, only to be told that Trey can't face him until he overcomes the mental barrier that is his rivalry with Marcus. Trey's response here is priceless.
Did you get the card?
I'll be right back.
You know, what I find most fascinating about these characters is their development wasn't needed. I'm sure the devs could have just left these 5 as the predictable lot I thought they would be at the beginning, and most players would just accept it. I know I would have. But the fact that some thought was thrown into the narrative here, and an effort was made to differentiate the different characters' personalities, had me wondering what else this title had to offer. But before we get to that, we need to answer an important question. I was surprised to see a game like Duel Masters on the PS2 RPG Master List. Duel Masters is a card game which wears its Yu-Gi-Oh! Inspiration on its sleeve. The card game at first glance is rather simple. Each turn, the player can do 4 things. First, you can discard a card from your hand in order to gain a mana point. Each monster or spell in your hand has a certain mana cost, and you must spend your mana each turn in order to summon them to the battlefield. Once a monster gets over their summoning sickness, they are able to attack either the opponent's monsters or the opponent's 5 shield cards. These shield cards act as one's life points, and once depleted, the player is open for an attack that ends the match. The basics are easy to pick up on, but the in-depth strategies took me a second to figure out. For example, some monsters have specific attributes such as the ability to shield the player from attack, taking the damage themselves. Or you have cards that, if destroyed, destroy the monster that attacked them. There are even more complicated attributes, such as the ability to tap your opponent's monsters or untap your own. Now, as far as an RPG goes, I think the mechanics around your personal rank and the monster collecting aspects are what make this a role-playing game. Collecting cards feels less like a Yu-Gi-Oh! Or Magic the Gathering type of situation, and more like a Pokemon mechanic. You see, each of your characters starts out with a basic 2-element deck. Where you go from there is really up to you. There are signature creatures you can collect that kinda become the mascot of your deck. Featuring a single monster so prominently is what made your deck feel less like a collection of cards and more like a team of monsters. It's also what gave credit to the RPG argument in my mind. Depending on how formidable your opponent is, you'll gain points towards a ranking if you beat them. The ultimate ranking is Master, and it takes dozens of battles to get there. You are required to reach the level just under Master in order to advance to the end of each campaign. So there is some grinding necessary. This, above all else, is what convinced me I was playing an RPG. It's also what almost lost me. That is, until I discovered a trick. As I said, I started with Flynn. Flynn's deck was a dark nature type deck. Now, if I hadn't started with him and had a little more experience, I would have quickly realized that I was playing with probably the third or fourth best type of deck, Water and Dark being the best. But for a new player who didn't quite understand the mechanics, this deck was irritating and made no sense. This gave me the impression that Duel Masters was a hard game. My lowest point was here, where Knight wouldn't let me advance the story until I reached a higher rank. I ended up grinding for a few hours, and seeing as the matches were taking 10 to 15 minutes each, I quickly lost my patience. It was at this point that I turned to the internet for help and discovered something rather interesting. Duel Masters has button input cheats. Specifically, if you hold R3, then press L1, R1, L1, you will automatically win the match. Now, for those of you new to the challenge, in-game cheats are not off limits. I used the invincibility cheat to defeat the final boss in Baldur's Gate Dark Alliance, and I used multiple in-game quote-unquote cheats to level in Final Fantasy XII. What I didn't want to happen was let this cheat warp my experience in some way. So, like Uncle Ben always says, with this newfound power, I decided to make a rule for myself. I would only use the cheat for non-story related duels. This worked in my favor, as changing your deck strategy requires a lot of tedious grinding that I was no longer required to do. I didn't realize just how much of an impact this cheat had on my experience until I saw the average playtime. My playthrough clocked in at around 17 hours, and I did everything I could in this game. The average playthrough landed between 20 and 25 hours. That means that I potentially got back 8 hours of my life by simply skipping non-essential fights. Once I figured this out, changing decks I didn't like and ranking up became easy, allowing me to focus on building each deck however I wanted. This also gave me a lot of runway to experiment, and experiment I did, until I found the single most broken strat in the entire game. Discovering the instant win cheat was a game changer, but I didn't learn about it until I reached the second campaign. This meant that Flynn's deck was more or less organic. Flynn's elements were dark in nature. Nature is pretty straightforward. It's an element that lets you build up mana quickly so you can summon your biggest monsters to the battlefield. I didn't realize this while playing as Flynn and ended up mostly ignoring the element. Dark uses many of the complicated abilities in the game. You have some cards that die upon winning a match, or kill the opponent's monster if they are defeated. One thing I did notice during my playthrough of Flynn was that low mana cost cards were kinda broken. When it came to Dark, this guy that only cost 1 mana and died upon attacking a shield was one of the best. My main strat with Flynn was pretty much go face, attacking shield cards as quickly as possible. Rebecca's campaign was where I really started to understand the elemental potentials. Rebecca started out with fire and water nature cards. I didn't realize it immediately, but this was a pretty decent combination, probably third or second best. Fire is simple. They do the most damage of any of the natures. Fire hardly has any nuance to it. Its main goal is to have the highest attack power of any monster on the field. Water is built almost entirely around shield monsters, and shield monsters are busted. I, once again, kept things pretty organic with Rebecca. I used the water shield monsters to protect myself while my fire monsters took out the opponent. Towards the end of Rebecca's route, I did gain a low mana cost card called the Candy Drop. The Candy Drop could surpass shield monsters and attack the player directly. A strategy started to form in my mind by the time Rebecca's campaign was over, but I had only pulled a single Candy Drop and my fire water deck seemed to be doing just fine. The third campaign I played was Trey's, and it was here where I really started to experiment with the elements. Trey's deck was made up of nature and light cards. Now, light is easily the worst element in the game. The cards are complicated and their strategies are situational at best. There were some decent cards. For example, the light deck had a low cost shield monster which came in handy. But overall, it's the worst element of the 5. Nature, however, can potentially rival water and dark. Nature is all about building up mana quickly, and I knew this by the time I got to Trey. So I decided to do something I hadn't yet and make a 3-element deck. I reluctantly kept light and added water for the shields. I then used my nature cards to build up my mana and summon out the strongest monsters in the game. This was a fun deck as I focused less on defense and more on offense. Sure, most battles were close, but I managed to win the majority of them. Once I got to Luke's campaign and realized he had a light-dark deck, which aside from fire and light, make up one of the worst combinations of the game, I decided to change up his deck completely and try out a strat I thought up way back in Rebecca's route. I changed Luke's deck to a dark water deck, which is undoubtedly the best combo in Duel Masters. I used dark mainly for its shields and a specific boobacious monster that cleared the battlefield. I then packed his deck with water shields, card drawing spells, and the maximum amount of candy drops I could. The strategy was simple. Lay down a wall of shields, then summon 1 to 2 candy drops. Use dark spells to enhance their attack, and go straight for the player. This strat was foolproof, and the only thing going against it was sometimes it took a while to draw a candy drop. Of all the decks, this was my favorite to play, as it felt so overwhelmingly powerful. I finished with Rusty's campaign, and with him I decided to do a 3-element deck similar to Trey's. This time it was a nature, fire, and water deck, which was good. Not amazing, but still good. Once I beat the 5 campaigns, each taking less time than the previous, as with each battle I learned how to better play the game, I moved into the final tournament with Widow and her minions. The tournament plays out as you would expect. You play as each of the 5 characters as they move up in the rankings. Each competed in 3 matches, the final match being against their element's leader. The first 2 matches weren't difficult, but they definitely played more aggressively. Once you reached your final opponent, each of the elemental leaders utilized their element's potential to its fullest. This was the hardest part of the entire game. Sure, the elemental leaders were good, but that's not exactly what made it difficult. You see, when I ended each campaign, I didn't realize that my characters' decks were locked in for the tournament. This wasn't a big problem for characters like Luke and Trey, as their decks were incredibly strong. But for Rebecca, Rusty, and specifically Flynn, my first campaign, having to beat these matches with subpar decks was pretty difficult. Flynn was the hardest. His dark nature deck was terrible, and it took me multiple tries before I could beat Marcus. Aside from that though, I made everyone else's deck work. The story wraps up with a battle against Widow and your choice of character. Because of the injustice, I chose Luke. Oh, and the fact that his deck was absolutely busted. Widow didn't stand a chance, and it was only fitting that Candy Drop delivered the finishing blow. I asked my daughter one day, what is the definition of cool? And she said unicorn shirts and pierced ears. Now, she's wrong, but I realized something about the word cool. You can't define it. Cool is essentially confidence in oneself. Unicorn shirts and pierced ears can be cool. It can also be incredibly uncool. It all depends on the confidence. Duel Masters is kinda cool. It's confident in itself, and that confidence seems to infect the player. What is also cool are some of these monsters' designs. During the late 90s, early 2000s, you really had 2 varieties of monsters in games. You had the Pokemon designs, more like mascots that sought to appeal to a younger audience, and then you had the Digimon, edgy designs with a more complex mixture of themes. Duel Masters falls on the Digimon side, and I kinda love it. The fire elements took it for me. These monsters looked epic. The artwork behind some of the monsters, which you see anytime there's a loading screen, are truly amazing. All in all, after 17 hours of play, Duel Masters convinced me that this, and this, and this, and even this was cool. Duel Masters is a surprisingly good game. It's not a great game, and it most certainly isn't a perfect game, but it's a solid experience that had me hooked from beginning to end. The worst thing this title does is give a terrible first impression. A cheap art style, generic looking characters, and a battle system that struggles to get off the ground all hinder one's experience. But hidden strategies, interesting monster designs, surprisingly fun character dialogue, and a predictable yet engaging game loop all help this title land in the upper part of my PS2 RPG list. I do recommend everyone play it, if only for its unique take on the RPG genre. And that's my retrospective. If you'd like to support me on this journey, consider becoming a Patreon member and donate today. Any amount helps. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you all later. Hey, if you like that, check out some of my other retrospectives by clicking on the box on the right. I also have other content, so check that out as well. See ya.